303 billion barrels. That's how much oil Venezuela has. The largest proven reserve on planet Earth. Bigger than Saudi Arabia. Bigger than Iran, bigger than every Middle Eastern country combined. And on January 3rd, 2026, when U.S. Delta Force captured Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro, operational control over those 303 billion barrels just shifted to the United States. While every headline screamed, "Dictator arrested," they buried what actually happened. And here's what they're not telling you. The headline screamed, "Justice served." But buried in paragraph 12 of most news stories was this: China is owed $60 billion by Venezuela. Two American oil companies have been waiting 17 years for this exact moment. And the largest debt restructuring in modern history is about to wipe out Chinese loans at pennies on the dollar. So here's the question nobody's asking. Was this really about arresting a dictator, or was this about 303 billion barrels? I spent hours reading OPEC reports, U.S. Energy Administration databases, and Chinese lending trackers to find out. Not headlines, not political spin, just documented numbers about what happened and what it means. Because here's what's wild. The media spent hours covering drug charges. The financial implications? 2 paragraphs. Maybe. By the end of this video, you'll know why Venezuela's 303 billion barrels matter more than Saudi Arabia's 267 billion. You'll see the exact sanctions timeline that collapsed Venezuelan production by 67%. And you'll understand why China just lost $40 billion while ExxonMobil is about to collect on a 17-year-old debt. But first, let me show you something that doesn't make sense. Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than every Middle Eastern country combined. So why was Venezuela collapsing while Saudi Arabia got rich? That contradiction is the key to everything. Venezuela sits on 303.2 billion barrels according to OPEC's 2025 statistical bulletin. Saudi Arabia has 267 billion. That's a 36 billion barrel advantage. The United States has 45 billion barrels. Venezuela's reserves are 7 times larger than America's entire supply. These aren't estimates, these are proven reserves. Confirmed by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, documented by every major energy database on Earth. But here's the problem, and this is critical. Venezuela's oil is extra heavy crude, thick, sulfurous. It's basically tar. You can't just pump it and sell it. It requires specialized technology, and only a handful of refineries in the world can process it. Where are those refineries? The Gulf Coast of the United States. Venezuela has the oil. America has the only refineries that can turn it into money. Remember that, because it explains everything that happens next. Now here's where it gets interesting. Most of Venezuela's oil sits in the Orinoco Belt. The U.S. Geological Survey documented up to 513 billion barrels of recoverable oil there. That's double Saudi Arabia's entire reserves in one geological formation. So again, why was Venezuela broke? This is where China comes in. And this is the part that got zero coverage. China lent Venezuela $105 billion since 2007. The deal was simple. China lends money, Venezuela ships oil. At peak, Venezuela was sending 600,000 barrels per day to China. Everyone wins. Except Venezuela's production collapsed. From 3 million barrels per day in 2000 to 1 million in 2025. That's a 67% drop according to OPEC data. Venezuela couldn't repay the loans. China restructured twice. In 2016, grace period. In 2020, another moratorium. Conservative estimates say China is still owed $60 billion. And then January 3rd happened. So, what happens to $60 billion in Chinese debt when the U.S. just captured the country that owes it? Here's what typical sovereign defaults look like. Creditors recover 20 to 40 cents on the dollar. If China gets 30 cents back on $60 billion, they recover $18 billion, they write off $42 billion. But this isn't a typical default, because China can't force repayment, and the collateral, Venezuelan oil, is now under U.S. operational control. Beijing's leverage just evaporated. They can complain, they can protest at the UN, but they don't control the oil fields. They don't control export terminals. The United States does. For context, that $42 billion write-off, that's 15% of China's entire annual Belt and Road lending. From one country, one default, but wait, because it gets better. 2 American oil companies saw this coming. 2007, Hugo Chavez nationalizes oil. ExxonMobil loses their massive Cerro Negro project. They file for arbitration, claim $14.7 billion in losses, 2014. They win $1.6 billion. Venezuela never pays. Most companies would move on. ExxonMobil didn't. They kept the claim active. 17 years waiting. January 3rd, 2026. The wait ends. Chevron played it differently. When Chavez demanded new terms, Chevron accepted. When others left, Chevron stayed. They maintained operations through sanctions with special U.S. Treasury licenses. PDVSA now owes Chevron $3.5 billion. But here's what matters more. Chevron has people on the ground right now. They know which infrastructure works, which wells can restart quickly, That knowledge is worth billions. Industry analysts estimate Venezuela needs $58 to $100 billion in infrastructure investment. ExxonMobil is positioned to collect their old debt plus bid on new contracts. Chevron already has operational presence. But here's what nobody's connecting. This didn't start January 3rd, 2026. There's a documented sanctions timeline. And when you see it, you realize something. Each sanction targeted specific operational layers with surgical precision. August 2017, executive order bans PDVSA from U.S. financial markets. Venezuela can't finance operations. Production drops 15%. January 2019, PDVSA designated as narcotics organization. $7 billion in assets frozen. Production drops 40%. April 2019, secondary sanctions on shipping. Any vessel touching Venezuelan crude gets blacklisted. Insurance companies refuse coverage. Production drops 25%. March 2020, the kill shot. U.S. bans diluent exports to Venezuela. Here's why that matters. Heavy crude can't move without diluent. It's too thick. You need to blend it with lighter petroleum products to make it flow through pipelines. No diluent, no production. Physics. Production collapses 30% almost immediately. Result? 2000. 2.9 million barrels per day. 2025, 1 million barrels per day. Was this a coordinated 20-year strategy or adaptive policy that capitalized on opportunities? The outcome is identical either way. Venezuela's ability to extract its own oil collapsed systematically over 2 decades, which raises an obvious question. If this oil is so valuable, why didn't oil prices spike when Maduro got captured, January 3rd, 2026? Brent crude barely moved. No panic, no spike. Why? Spare capacity. The International Energy Agency says global spare oil production capacity is 5.8 million barrels per day. That's 6% of total demand. Highest since 2015. Saudi Arabia alone could replace Venezuela's entire production 3 times over just by turning valves. The market already priced in Venezuela being offline. This was predictable. The capture doesn't remove supply. It potentially adds supply back. But here's the timeline. Francisco Monaldi, director of Latin America Energy Program at Rice University, said it would take at least a decade and over $100 billion to reach 4 million barrels per day. Realistic timeline for meaningful increases? 18 to 36 months minimum. Months 1 to 6. Security stabilization, damage assessment. Months 7 to 12. Maybe 200,000 barrels per day from idle wells, just turning valves back on. Months 13 to 24. Another 500,000 barrels per day if diluent gets restored. That diluent ban from 2020, if the U.S. lifts it, production could jump relatively fast. If it stays, production stays constrained no matter how much money gets invested. But there's something else nobody's talking about. Venezuela isn't just oil. The Orinoco mining arc covers 12% of Venezuela's territory. Gold, roughly 7,000 tons. At 2,750 per ounce, that's $200 billion. Coltan, $100 billion in his estimated reserves. Every smartphone, laptop, server needs coltan. Rare earth elements, 300,000 metric tons. China controls 80% of rare earth processing, essential for electric vehicles, wind turbines, military systems, semiconductors. The U.S. has spent billions trying to build alternative rare earth supply chains since 2018. Mostly failed. Too complex, too expensive. Venezuela is the shortcut. If the U.S. brings Venezuelan rare earth online by 2028, 2030, it breaks China's monopoly. Total mineral wealth beyond oil? Roughly $2 trillion. Caveat, these haven't been verified by Western auditors in over a decade, but the geological surveys exist. And then there's gold reserves. 150 to 200 tons at Bank of England, another 80 tons domestically. At current prices, $20 to $25 billion. The Bank of England already refused to release that gold to Maduro since 2019. That gold could now pay arbitration awards, fund reconstruction, satisfy creditors, expect legal battles. So what happens now? Let's talk concrete implications. First, debt restructuring. Venezuela owes $150 to $170 billion total, $60 billion in defaulted bonds, $60 billion to China, billions to Russia, billions in arbitration awards. Venezuelan bonds trade at 27 to 32 cents on the dollar, according to Market Access. The market expects 30% recovery. Citigroup said in November 2025 that Venezuela needs at least 50% principal haircut for sustainability. If China accepts 30 cents on the dollar, that's a $42 billion loss from one country. But here's the ripple effect. Ecuador owes China $18 billion. Argentina owes billions. Pakistan, African nations, Latin America. Every Belt and Road borrower just watched what happens when you default and the U.S. restructures your debt by controlling the collateral. Message received. Chinese loans aren't protected by Chinese power if Washington intervenes. That changes belt and road risk calculations permanently. Second, U.S. companies get access. Trump said January 3rd, quote, "We're going to have our very large United States oil companies go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure. $58 billion minimum, according to PDVSA. Up to $100 billion for full rehabilitation, according to analysts. Halliburton, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes. These companies have decades of heavy oil experience, existing equipment, technical expertise Venezuela can't access elsewhere. But it's not just oil companies. Service contracts, infrastructure rebuilding, logistics, security. We're talking about a decade-long reconstruction project that dwarfs most development programs. Third implication, strategic minerals. If the U.S. develops Venezuelan rare earth capacity, it's a genuine alternative to Chinese supply chains. Massive implications for EVs, defense, renewables, semiconductors. China's 80% rare earth control has been a strategic vulnerability for years. Multiple administrations tried to fix it, billions spent. Limited progress. Venezuela potentially solves that problem. Existing deposits, friendly government, proximity to U.S. markets. Now zoom out, because this might represent a completely different model for resource acquisition. Iraq 2003, full military invasion, congressional authorization, $2 trillion spent according to Watson Institute. Hundreds of thousands dead, years of occupation. Minimal resource extraction for the U.S. Strategic failure. Venezuela 2026, targeted special operations capture, no invasion, no long-term occupation announced, temporary U.S. administration, cost under $1 billion estimated, outcome, control over 303 billion barrels, elimination of Chinese and Russian influence, rare earth independence, debt restructuring favoring U.S. creditors, infrastructure contracts for U.S. companies. Was this designed over 20 years or opportunistic adaptation? Functionally identical result? Is this a template? That's analysis, not fact. But consider the profile. Resource-rich nation. Heavy external debt, political isolation, geopolitical misalignment with U.S., Iran, 208 billion barrels, sanctions since 1979, isolated, Bolivia, world's largest lithium reserves, Chinese investment, unstable, multiple African nations, critical minerals, Chinese loans, political chaos. The Venezuela situation proves you don't need traditional invasion if you control financial architecture and can apply sustained economic pressure. So let's answer the questions we opened with. Was this about justice or 303 billion barrels? The operation was legal under U.S. law. The drug charges are documented, but the strategic outcome is undeniable. Access to the world's largest oil reserve. Why couldn't Venezuela get rich from their oil? Extra heavy crude requires specialized refining, U.S. refineries, plus systematic sanctions collapse their ability to produce, ship, and sell. What happens to China's $60 billion, likely restructured at 30 cents on the dollar, $42 billion loss? Message sent to every Belt and Road borrower. Was this planned for 20 years? Sanctions timeline shows systematic targeting of operational capabilities. Whether coordinated or adaptive, the result is identical. Is this a template? The profile fits multiple countries, resource-rich, debt-heavy, politically isolated. Traditional invasion isn't necessary if you control global finance. Here's what we know for certain. Verifiable, documented. January 3rd, 2026, U.S. Delta Force captured Maduro, confirmed by White House, Pentagon, every major outlet, 303.2 billion barrels. Confirmed by OPEC 2025, Statistical Bulletin, U.S. Energy Information Administration, $60 billion Chinese debt. Documented by Aid Data Research, major investment banks, 67% production collapse, OPEC data, International Energy Agency verification, systematic sanctions 2017-2020, documented executive orders, Treasury announcements, U.S. temporary administration, Trump's direct statement, broadcast live January 3rd. The media covered the arrest, the drug charges, the democracy restored narrative, the economics, 2 paragraphs, 303 billion barrels, $60 billion in Chinese debt, $2 trillion in minerals, 2 decades of sanctions, strategic repositioning, debt restructuring, infrastructure contracts. You now have the numbers, the timeline, the sources, the strategic context. If this was useful, hit like and subscribe because I'll be tracking what happens next. China's debt restructuring, U.S. company contracts, whether this model gets replicated. The world's largest oil reserve just changed hands. Based on coverage, most people have no idea what actually happened. Now you do. But here's the real question. If the U.S. can do this to Venezuela, a country with 303 billion barrels and $60 billion owed to China, what stops them from doing it to the next resource-rich, debt-heavy, politically isolated nation? The answer might be nothing, and that changes everything.